So what I wanted to cover today is how I installed this particular cast iron vise in this workbench so I could have a much wider jaw, which I haven't really seen anyone else talk about much other than maybe extending it a little bit. I wanted to talk about my old vise that I had here and why I removed that and went back to the cast iron quick release vise. Let's jump in here and I'll talk about why I changed my vise. When I had my original top, and if you've seen the video where I talked a little bit about my workbench in the last workshop chat, you'll see that I had a top like this one over here, and on that I had this particular cast iron quick release vise that I actually have on here at the moment, which is a brand new Eclipse cast iron vise, and I got that because it was relatively cheap and Paul Sellers recommended them and a lot of people use them, and they were just very commonly available, even secondhand, but the new one for me ended up being slightly cheaper than buying a secondhand one to restore it, so that's what I stuck with. When I created the current top that I've got here, this laminated Robot style bench, I wanted more traditional style vise, and the worktop was too thick to actually install that cast iron vise straight into the top, so I was going to have to drop it down anyway. And so at that time I decided that I was going to install something a little bit larger, because the quick release one that you see here, it was a small clamping area, and I decided I wanted a more traditional look for a vise. And so I decided that I was going to install this giant Jarrah piece on here that comes down 150mm, 500mm wide. And so in my search for a larger vise that wasn't too expensive, I picked up one of these cheap vises with the rails that are supposedly meant to support them and a nice thread in the middle. And the way this one worked, it fitted with 3 holes through the front here, which you then screw this on, attach these rails to it, so it punches through here and it punches through the back one into a backing piece that this thread attaches to, which I've got over there, but I don't really need it to explain this. And that backing piece is screwed in behind. And if you saw my recent video where I put this Crubber vise lining on here, you will have seen the holes that were left there, and that was from this particular vise. So the big problems I had with this vise was that it racked like crazy. Even if I had anti-racking blocks in there, it wouldn't clamp the work well enough ever, really. And part of the reason is, if you have a look at this, even when these are done up tight, which they are, these support rails still rock, the thread rocks, there's just no attention to detail within this. Now, this was just one that a cheap Chinese brand that I just got from the local woodworking store, I believe it was, and as far as I know they no longer sell this one, and probably for good reason, because it's not really fit for purpose. It doesn't actually perform the function very well. Obviously you can clamp some stuff, especially if you're clamping just above the thread here, but that is really the only time that I found this vise worked properly. And so I had a dilemma. I had the jaw on my vise, a wooden style that looked like the Veritas ones, at a much cheaper price, which was why I went for this cheap one, which was only, I think it was like 50 bucks Australian, versus the Veritas ones that they were well over $600, if I believe correctly, back then. And so I didn't really want to spend the amount on the Veritas face vise, whether it was the twin screw or even just the single tail vise one. I didn't want to spend the money on either of those, even though that was kind of what I was looking for, and perhaps that is what I should have gone for, but I didn't. So in the effort of saving money, I ventured to see what I could do to remove this vise, and I didn't think it was necessarily a bad thing, because a nice strong Acme vise thread like this, I can repurpose at a later date for something else. The thread works fine. The problem wasn't really the thread, but the entire vise itself. And so I wanted to eliminate racking. I wanted to save money. So I started to look at what I could do with the cast iron vise that I had already had, that had been sitting to the wayside for a little bit. And I thought, well, that vise didn't really rack at all. It's a good quality vise, that works well. So I seeked out to install it with the new vise jaws, but we were going back to the old vise. So let me show you exactly what I've done down here. We're going to dive under the workbench and I'll show you how I've actually installed this vise. So what you can see here is the back, the bottom of the cast iron vise, 2 support rails, the threaded rod that moves it, the quick release bar here which disengages it with the mechanism here, and then the cast iron housing which is actually in an L shape here. So this comes along and it's got a vertical face which comes up the height of the front of the vise. Now that allows those 2 parts to come together to clamp and allows pressure, so it puts its own pressure against itself and allows these rods to work and support the whole thing and to stop it racking. So in an effort for you to be able to see this properly, I just wanted to get you in this nice close view here. So this is the front piece that runs up into the front. So you can see that I've dropped this entire vise down so it sits under the bottom here. So this is running right under the bottom of those wooden jaws here, and that's going to allow me to have not only a deeper clamping section, but it's also allowing me to install these big wide jaws, which doesn't require me to drop it, but it's allowing me to get more depth, which is why I went with this, because I didn't want to cut these off since I had them on here. Because I couldn't get this up under here, what I did is I measured this distance here and measured that distance down on the face of the vise, and that left me with a line. So I knew how far down it sat, so I was sitting it just up off the rod so it didn't impede the rod. You can see on this side here I actually put a little bit of leather under here, and that was to help actually lift this up in a line with this one here, but also stop it from binding on the rods, because this side moves, so I could have it nice and tight here, but I didn't want the wood to actually touch it, because obviously these had already been planed to the same width, and so I was trying to work out how I could get that to sit up in alignment, because the alignment of these was a little bit off, because if you see here where I'm rocking this, there is a little bit of movement in it, and so when it was actually sitting in its correct position like it is now with it sitting down ever so slightly, I had to have them in alignment, and that was my solution, a little bit of leather here. Okay, so back to how I got this vertical piece here to actually fit. So I knew how far in I had to mortise it for it to actually fit up into here. And so I did set about actually doing a mortise. And so I knew the alignment was going to be, so I held the vise under here even though I couldn't push it right up, just so I could get the center value of where I needed the lines. And so I knew where to make my mortise, so I didn't make it too long, so I didn't have to do more work than I wanted to. Then what I did is, using the jaw here as a guide, I brought my brace and bits in, and I bored out the depth, which ended up being maybe yay far up into this workbench, and then cleaned it out with a chisel. So obviously when I did this, I had to put a packer in to support the back of this, because we've dropped the whole thing down. Now this does mean there are 2 screws on that front vertical piece. I couldn't use those, but I figured that wasn't such a problem because it was up in a mortise. It's not really going to rack on the front too much, and so I never had an issue with that. So what I did is, to actually work out this packing gap, I slipped the whole thing in and did this front jaw up so it clamped on to this back one here. Now, with that clamped on there, I had my hands free and it was holding itself there. So then I could measure this distance on either side, and then I had to set about grabbing some scraps that were roughly the right size and then gluing them together, and then fine-tuning it with a hand plane, just taking off small shavings until I got it to fit just right. And then all of that pack was glued together and then screwed up into this, through all of this, up into the workbench top with, I think it was 10 or 12 screws. I really didn't want this packer coming loose because there's quite a bit of weight in one of these vices, and I knew I didn't want it to rack, I didn't want it to move, I didn't want to have any issues with it, so I glued it to the workbench, screwed it to the workbench, and it's it's not failed me since. Then had to actually attach the vise. So I once again, after putting that packer in, put the vise back in, did it back up, held it in place. Then we have 4 screw positions for some large coach screws or lag screws from wherever country you're from, giant screws. Big threads to actually hold the weight. Backed up with a washer, and so what I did is I ended up having these back ones. So you can see here they're open-ended, and so if you don't have the luxury of doing it up, what you can do here, and I had to do this when I actually came to install it, because you line these screws up, drill those holes, put those 2 back screws in first, leave them a little bit down, and because they're open-ended, you can bring the whole assembly in and hook it over those screws. And so that was why I had washers on here as well, because that was a big open size here, and these coach screws were not as large as that opening, which is fine. And so I slipped it up under there, so what I had to do was to get that in there, is I had to open the entire thing right up like so, and then I brought it up on quite a steep angle, so I kept these very loose. They were down sort of here. So I could slip that in and get that front part of the vise up under here, pushed up, and then once that was looped over the screws, I was able to actually push it right up and clamp it back in place, as I'd showed you. Like that, held it in place, did those 2 screws up, drilled some in the front here, did them up, and then I had all 4 of them in here, and it's been a rock solid construction. So I hope you enjoyed this video on mainly the cast iron vise here, and the issues and experiences that I've had with that and other cheaper style vices, along with how I installed that cast iron vise. If you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing. And while you're down there, please sound off in the comments. What experiences have you had with different vices that you've used? I'm interested to hear, you know, wooden screw vices like this style here, maybe some different branded ones like Veritas and that. I'm curious to hear your experiences and any issues that you've had with them. And if you'd like to support me a little bit further, please consider checking out the video up here where I go through building my bench and all the mistakes I made, and also the playlist here which covers everything to do with my workbench that I've created, including work holding, vices, all that sort of thing. Bye for now.